All right, so now we're going to be moving to understanding the processes of a species richness. So let me just summarize everything up to this moment. We have described that there are very unique characteristics that make life possible on this planet. Once those characteristics allow for life to exist, life kind of diversify quite dramatically. There have been moments in the history of our planet where there have been mass extinction events. Today we are not in such a thing, but we are in our way there. But along this process of species originating and going extinct, they reach places, and normally the places where where the similarity is very high in species richness is what is called a biogeographical region, and those are normally defined by boundaries on the distribution of a species, and those boundaries where the species are found is what is called the geographical range, and it's the overlap of those geographical ranges that allows you then to count how many species are on a given place, that then leads you to the pattern of a species richness. In the last class, we look at how those patterns look like from the global scale, thinking that there could be 8.7 million species, but only 1.5 million had a name, to where are those species in the world. Most of the evidence points to the fact that most of the species are likely found in the tropics, although the pattern is general, is not universal, meaning that there are some exceptions to that. And there are still limitations though in the data on how those global patterns are built, and we described those limitations in the last class. Today, we're moving to explaining those processes. Again, if we assume that everything is correct, what are the processes that have been suggested to explain why most of the species are in certain places? So again, if we assume that everything is correct, which we know is not, but we gotta keep moving given the data that we had, the general idea or conclusion is that there is a generality to the pattern of species richness, the pattern of species richness, which is for the number of species to peak in the tropics. Here is an example that we did for fish, but as Willig pointed out in his paper, that pattern of a negative relationship between latitude increasing and the number of species declining is found on many taxonomic groups that we know of. And again, while it's general, it's not universal, but it's relatively well understood that that's the way that the pattern in species richness looks like. Most of the species being in the tropics and lower at higher latitudes. Here is the pattern in 2 dimensions. This is mammals. This is the diversity of mammals. And you can see that the diversity of mammals, again, just like any other taxa or most other taxa, is higher at the tropics and it declines towards higher latitudes. But today we're going to be talking about the patterns, the processes to this pattern. What is driving this pattern? When it goes down to the process to explain the pattern, there is a very good paper by Willig that took all of the individual papers that have pointed out an explanation, and he came out with this massive table of all of the explanations for this pattern, and in that paper, he documented that there could be up to 32 different explanations for this pattern. So obviously, that number of explanations kind of exemplifies the diversity of human thinking, but it creates a huge problem for really understanding why biodiversity is the way it is. Let's look at the challenges that having so many hypotheses creates. The first challenge is this issue of multicollinearity. As I pointed out to you earlier, multicollinearity is basically when you have 2 predictors that for some reason are related to each other, like for instance, it could be precipitation and moisture, but then you have a dependent variable, could be a species richness. When you try to explain how much variance predictor 1 explains of that independent variable, you find that predictor 1 is going to explain some variance that has to be explained also by predictor 2, given the fact that predictor 1 and predictor 2 relate to each other. And this area of overlap, when the variance of one predictor can also be explained by another predictor, given that those 2 predictors are related, is what is called multicollinearity. Now, how significant is multicollinearity? This is a paper that we published back in the day where we try to identify the significance of this issue of multicollinearity. Here we had different hypotheses that could, for instance, be used to explain the diversity of fish in the oceans. We had temperature, salinity, variability in temperature, productivity. Again, these are variables as they relate to environment, and the reasoning there is that the environment is an important factor determining how many species get to be on a given place. We also had physiographic factors like the number of islands and the coastline length. We have biogenic factors like the amount of coral reefs that provide substrata for fish. We had anthropogenic factors as well, thinking that maybe humans can increase or decrease the number of richness. And there are other patterns and null models. So back here, we try to provide a set of explanations that have been proposed for the pattern of species richness, and we tested these explanations on the fishes of the Eastern Pacific because we had a very good database, very complete. Ross Robertson, he's not young anymore, but throughout his life, what he did, he traveled all of the Eastern Pacific, counting how many species are there. So it's one of those regions in the world that, thanks to him, we know very well how many species are on different places. So we made use of that beautiful database that he put together to test all of these hypotheses. So what we found was this: when you look at the effect of temperature explains 81% of the variance on a species richness of fish. Variability explains 21%. The number of islands explains 4%. The area of coral reefs explains 15%. The area of coastal development 25%. The rapport effect 64%. The mid-domain effect 90%. If you were to add up all of the variance that is explained by these variables, you find that combined they explain 359% of the variance. But you only had 100% of the variance that you can realistically explain. That then tells you the degree of overestimation that is being caused by the multicollinearity between these variables. And again, the sad consequence of this then is that we can just not really tell who among all of these variables are really the ones that are driving the species richness. And all of that again is because there is a huge diversity of variables that unfortunately are multicollinear to each other. Now, even in cases where we seem to know only a unique variable related to the species richness, how that variable influences the pattern is something that is still unclear. That's what is called the mechanism. Let me just give you an example here. Here, there is the diversity of fish, the diversity of everything that is in the ocean, in the Indian and Pacific Ocean. One of the things that you find in these two oceans is that there is an incredible diversity of species in this region called the IPR, in the Pacific region. And the question is, okay, we already know that there is a high diversity of species there. Why? So there are three contrasting hypotheses to explain this. One is what is called the center of origination. When you look at the number of islands on this place, there are thousands of islands located here. So these islands are actually places where species can originate there because they get to be isolated. So the idea of the origination is that the reason why you see gradients of species richness is because a lot of species originate there and they move towards towards more remote places, and then that creates a gradient from a lot of species here towards fewer species on the periphery. The other mechanism is what is called the center of overlap. This idea suggests that there are very clear biogeographical regions on all of these two oceans, and it's the overlap of those regions in that region of the IPR that leads to a lot of species being found on this region. It's nothing special about the region other than the fact that that's the place where most of the biodiversity of other regions overlap, and that will then lead you to having a lot of species there. The other mechanism, again, is that, again, just to simplify, in this case, origination is happening everywhere, and it's just the movement of species towards that place in the IPR that leads to having a lot of species in the IPR. The other idea is what is called the center of accumulation. This idea suggests that these red points here indicate areas where species are originating, and they are originating all around the Indian and Pacific Ocean. But when you look at the currents of this region, you find that in this region, in the Pacific side, the currents normally flow towards the IPR, and in the Indian Ocean, the currents normally flow towards the IPR as well. So it's basically this convergence of currents in this region that then leads to the species that were originated on those places converging in the Indo-Pacific, and this is what is called the center of accumulation. So here is an example where you have three contrasting mechanisms to explain a pattern of why there are so many species in the IPR. Let me give you another example. I want you to think about this relationship here between biodiversity and the number of people. I don't want to show you this just yet. I want you to pause this video and think about how this correlation is. We had already talked about people normally being not good for the biodiversity. With that being said, then how would you expect to be the correlation between the number of species and the number of people? Pause this video and let's get back at the end of your break. So I hope that you will have said, given that we know that people is not good for the biodiversity, that you will find that the biodiversity declines as the number of people increases. I hope that you guys kind of reasoning there that if you didn't know the data beforehand, and again, because it makes sense, right, that if we have negative impacts on biodiversity, as we increase the number of people, biodiversity declines. Again, just for you to to realize that in a science, everything needs to be tested and proved. When the scientists went and tested the hypothesis, what they found was that it was kind of the opposite. As you increase the number of people, you increase the number of species. Isn't that remarkable? This is a paper that was published by Bamford and another one by Araujo. They analyzed this pattern on the relationship between richness and biodiversity in Europe and in Africa, and they analyzed it for plants, birds, mammals, snakes, and amphibians. And everywhere they look, there was a positive relationship here. So the more people there is, the more species there are. Again, that was kind of contrasting given what we thought humans do to people. So that obviously then creates an interesting question, which is why? Why we know that people is negative, have mostly negative effects on biodiversity? Why is it that there are more species where there are more people? So there are multiple explanations for this. And there is a professor called Kevin Gaston from the UK. I had a couple papers that I have published with him. Super nice guy to work with, and he's like a rock star in his science, especially on biogeography. He has a very nice paper when he analyzed the likely explanations for this pattern. The first one is the fact that he speculates that maybe people and richness respond the same to the environment, just like some case of multicollinearity, where species richness, for instance, relate positively with temperature, and so are we. So that fact that the species richness and us correlate with the environment then forces us to be correlated with richness, but it's not that we are impacting richness. So that's one of the hypotheses. The other explanation that has been proposed, is that by us introducing new species, and species that are there being impacted and having a hard time to go extinct, then what that does is that we actually work as a way to increase the number of species, so that basically humans are creating a net gain of species in certain places. The other hypothesis is what is called the climate stability hypothesis. Basically what suggests here is that this similarity that we see today is a legacy of past glaciation. So back in the day when there were glaciations, obviously everything from species to humans were restricted mostly to a few places or pockets where the number of species and people were very high. As the glaciation went away, the diversity of species and people started spreading from those places, and that then forces the number of species to correlate with people. Again, not that we expand biodiversity, but rather than the two of us come from the same places. The final explanation is what is called the mid-disturbance hypothesis. So the idea here is that when humans, by us having negative impact on biodiversity, what we can do is to knock out species that become dominant. And by us knocking down species that become dominant, we allow species that are weak to prosper on those places. So the idea here is that when we humans go and we start disturbing ecosystems, we allow some kind of coexistence between species that could be very competitive. And if the species were there to be left alone, the species that is dominant will go extinct, and the species that is dominant will go to dominate, and the one that is weak will go to extinct. But by us being on those places, we kind of knock out the species that are dominant, allowing those two species to coexist. So those are the 4 different hypotheses that have been suggested to explain this correlation. And again, I'm using this as evidence to suggest that while we might find at times very strong relationships between the parent and a variable, that doesn't mean that we know very well how is it that variable leads to that pattern. Here is another example, again, where the mechanism is not very well known, which is the relationship between the number of species and temperature. Obviously, we get certain amount of energy that blasts our planet, and that energy is going to be more abundant in tropical areas, and that amount of energy is going to be fewer at the North and South Pole. And that distribution of energy on our planet then is speculated to influence not only temperature, but then as a result, the number of species. And indeed, many papers have documented this relationship. This is a paper by my friend Derek Dittensor from the Housing University. In this paper, he correlated the number of species in the planet against temperature in the oceans, and you can see that there is always a positive correlation no matter how you cut the data, right? So almost always, every time that there is an increase in temperature, places that are hotter normally have more species. So that's, again, a pattern that is highly related to a variable. But then what is the mechanism? There is a paper by Corey in Ecology Letters when he goes through how is it that temperature can make species be more abundant, right? As abundant, I mean in terms of number of species there. So he suggested 3 explanations for it. The first one is what is called the more individual hypothesis. So temperature, by it being related to a larger amount of energy that comes directly from the sun, then allows to have more individuals, and obviously there are more individuals, there could be potentially more chances for reproduction that then lead to having you more species. The other one is what is called the physiological tolerance hypothesis. This hypothesis suggests that what happens is that generating the evolutionary capacity to live on cold places is very hard. While it's relatively easy for most species to be able to tolerate warm temperatures, surviving colder temperatures is a physiological adaptation that is very rare. So this dissimilarity in the capacities of a species to cope with temperature allows a lot of species to be found in the tropics, where most species can survive, and very few species can survive at high latitudes. Again, it's just because they lack the capacity, the physiological capacity to tolerate those colder temperatures. That's again what is called the physiological tolerance hypothesis, which is that most of the species can survive warm but not cold conditions. The other explanation for the relationship between richness and temperature is what is called the speciation rate hypothesis. And what it suggests here is that when you increase temperature, there is normally a faster evolutionary rate. For some reason, a lot of species like to have sex when it gets hot, and that increases the chances of introducing mutations that then turn into more species. And that has been tested on multiple species, like insects mostly, where you can just crank up the temperature a little bit and see how those species reproduce. They have found the same similar things in bacteria as well. Again, case examples where anytime that you increase the temperature, you increase reproduction, and as a result, you increase the chances of introducing mutations that will then turn into different species. And again, here is another example where there is a very clear relationship between a parent, which is the number of species, a variable, which is temperature, but we have very unclear about how is it that temperature causes the richness. So that finishes the lecture today, the class on as it relates to patterns and processes. I want to finish up this class though by talking about the significance of us better identifying this pattern of species richness for the purpose of conservation. So there are at least 2 or 3 different important aspects of us knowing these patterns of species richness. The first one is that it allows you to identify areas that need to be protected. Those are what are called hotspots. Hotspots are places in the world that have the highest diversity of species, right? And it turns out that those places are not very abundant. And then the idea here is that you can use the pattern of species richness to then outline the boundaries of those hotspots for them to be protected. There are 2 efforts that have been done to do this. One is the paper by Myers that analyzed biodiversity hotspots on land, and you can see them here in red. Those are the places with the highest diversity of species anywhere in the world. And these are the species in the ocean. This is a paper by Callum Roberts, and he outlined the biodiversity hotspots in the oceans. So again, that's one attribute that is very important about us knowing the patterns in species richness better, which is to identify these boundaries where the species are found. The other important attributes of species richness for conservation is that it allows to identify what are the risks for biodiversity. So here's an example, for instance, of a paper by Sincota in which he analyzed the hotspots of biodiversity against the number of people, and he correlated those 2 things. And what he demonstrated here is that most of the people in the world are actually living on those hotspots. Again, most likely because of the fact that biodiversity relates with the number of people. As a result, where there is the most diversity in the world is where you have the most people, and he documented that on this figure here. So in this figure are every one of the 25 hotspots in the world that have been identified before by Myers. Again, those are the places with the highest diversity of species in the world. Those are the places that you think need to be protected, need to be removed from any human stressor. But when you look at the number of people on those hotspots, what you find is that on average, the global average density of people is 42, but inside those hotspots, the average density of people is 73 people. So you have almost twice the number of people living on those hotspots. So you can imagine, if we know that humans have different consequences that are normally negative to the species that live on those places, what we're talking based on this analysis of us knowing where the species are is that we can show that the human impacts could be potentially double the impacts on those places with the highest diversity. And again, that's one of the important attributes of us better knowing these patterns of species richness. Here's another example that was done by Derek Tittenson on his paper in Nature, where he analyzed the same deal but on the oceans. And here you can see the diversity of all taxa in the world, and in black are those polygons that had the highest diversity of species. He correlated that against the human footprint in the ocean, which is again a cumulative index of the magnitude of different impacts that are happening on every single pixel in the world. And what he managed to show on this paper is that almost all of the pixels in the world are under areas that had high human impacts. And again, it's another interesting benefit of us better knowing these patterns of species richness, which is not only to know what areas need to be protected, but what areas are most risk of humans. Let me summarize the two lectures as they relate to species richness. So we don't know really how many species are there in the world, but what we know is that there are about 1.5 million species that had a name, and there could be easily up to 8.7 million species. Where are those species in the world? Well, the reality is that we don't know very well. We have problems on the way that data is standardized. Some patterns can be overestimated depending on where we use geographical ranges, or there could be a lack of considerable data to build patterns based on census data. And that unfortunately leads to patterns that are weak, and not only the patterns are not reliable 100%, what are the processes to those patterns is also something that we don't know very well. And again, as I explained to you, there could be multiple statistical issues as they relate to multicollinearity and the fact that we had tons of variables that could explain these patterns. And again, not only we don't know very well the patterns, the processes are not very well known, and unfortunately that's very sad, because unfortunately this information about the patterns and processes of biodiversity are fundamental if we want to better protect those species. And that finishes the class for today, for this episode. See you guys in the next chapter.